Hello everyone, my name is Lacey Quail and I am an Extension Livestock Management Specialist with North Dakota State University, based out of the North Central Research Extension Center in Minot, North Dakota. As part of this backgrounding series, it's important that we think about how we can best manage our heifers, whether they will end up in the beef supply chain or back into our operations as replacement females. So we're going to start today with a bit of a math lesson. Back in geometry, you may have remembered hearing that a square is a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. And how can that be, right? Well, the requirements of a square are more precise than they are for a rectangle. So a square meets the requirements of a rectangle, which are 2 sets of parallel sides and 4 right angles, but a rectangle does not meet the requirements of a square, which are, again, 2 sets of parallel sides and 4 right angles, with the addition of all sides must be equal in length. So to say it maybe a little bit more eloquently is that a square is a more specific type of rectangle. Oddly enough, I think this concept applies to managing heifers as well. A good replacement heifer will likely feed out just fine and be a good feedlot heifer, but a good feedlot heifer doesn't necessarily mean that she will become a good replacement heifer. So a good replacement heifer needs to check just a few more boxes than a feedlot heifer, and is a more specific type of heifer compared to a feedlot heifer. So in those terms, I think it's important that we manage heifers in a way that they could be successful as replacements if we need them to be, knowing that if they don't make the cut, they can always become feedlot heifers. This gives us the most flexibility when it comes to marketing, herd expansion, and feed utilization. In general, heifers have far more marketing options than a steer calf. This time of year, weaned heifers can be sold as calves or retained and grown, referred to as heifer development or backgrounding, and then heifers can be sold after that period of time to be fed to finish or sold into another operation as their replacements. If they're not sold after the development period, heifers can be retained and exposed to their first breeding season, and then again either sold as exposed replacements or as confirmed bred replacements, or retained in your own operation as replacement females. So there are several avenues here where heifers can be marketed, and so we want to manage them in a way where they can be successful and profitable at any of these points. Whether you make your replacement decisions at weaning, or maybe you give every heifer the opportunity to become pregnant and then sort off which stay and which are marketed as opens or bred heifers later in the fall, we can manage heifers in a way that they are profitable in any avenue. So because a replacement heifer has a few more specific requirements, we need to think about managing the heifers in a way that they could fit as replacements, even if they end up being marketed instead of retained. I think it's safe to say that most operations probably have a pretty similar goal for the replacement heifers, regardless of maybe what breed they raise or where they might be located. We'd like for those heifers to attain puberty prior to the breeding season so that they can become pregnant around 14 to 15 months of age, which sets them up to calve at 2 years old, and we'd love for them to do that unassisted. We then expect them to wean a marketable calf and rebreed following calving for their second calf in a timely manner so that they stay on a yearly calving interval. Those are all pieces of the puzzle that lead to maximum productivity in a replacement heifer. So knowing that, I think it's important to say that there's no right or wrong way to go about heifer development, but these are some goals that we need to consider when we think about profitability of the operation and how replacement heifers contribute to that profitability. In this way, we really need to think of heifer development like a backgrounding operation, because meeting our break-even with heifers as they become part of the cow herd is a very critical time point. So this leads me to introduce the 2 systems that are typically considered for the management of heifers. On the top half of the slide, we have what most of you would probably consider to be the more traditional approach to heifer development, where heifers are kept and fed in a dry lot system and gain weight at a moderate to moderately high rate of gain. In the last few decades, there has been considerable research on alternative development strategies that utilize extensive grazing of crop residue or dormant range to potentially reduce development costs. And I think it's important, again, to recognize here that there's not a right or wrong system, but comparing each to what might fit your environment best is going to be key here. We have a variety of types of cattle operations across North Dakota and across the country, and there are regions that each of these systems could fit in very well. So traditionally, the process for decades has been to develop heifers to 60 to 65% of their mature body weight prior to their first breeding season. So the research that's supported this started several decades ago and is focused on maximizing the number of heifers that reach puberty prior to their first breeding season and become pregnant in that first breeding season, which is not inherently negative. However, it might not be what's optimal in some environments if you consider the whole system, whether that be feed costs to reach that body weight, or maybe the percentage of heifers that may come up open after their first calving season, trying to get pregnant with that second calf, again, depending on the environment. So I think we can all agree that we're constantly working towards genetic progress in the beef industry, and part of that progress has been when heifers reach puberty. Some of the more recent research actually has shown that the majority of heifers are attaining puberty around 55 to 60% of their mature body weight, which has led to research focusing on whether or not heifers can be developed and managed to lighter weights prior to their first breeding season to potentially ease up on some of those development costs without sacrificing reproductive performance in that first year as a heifer and then throughout her lifetime as a mature cow. So to compare heifers managed in these two systems, knowing that they represent two very different types of operations across the country, I'd like to go through a study from Nebraska about 13 years ago. In this study, they developed heifers either in the traditional dry lot system or on corn residue and native range for the majority of the developmental period. They repeated this for 3 years, and all heifers were a similar body weight to begin with, and then they were synchronized with progesterone and either time-AI'd or inseminated off of estrus before being turned out with bulls for a 60-day breeding season. So after weaning, heifers entered the dry lot anywhere from 150 to 208 days, depending on the year, or those heifers were developed on corn residue and native range if needed due to snowfall for anywhere from 91 to 135 days, depending on the year. The grazing heifers were then placed in a dry lot for the last around 1 or 2 months prior to their first breeding season. So before we get into the specifics on growth rates and reproductive performance, I think it's important to mention that by the end of the development period, dry lot heifers were developed to 65% of their mature body weight, and grazing heifers were developed to 56% of their mature body weight. So I don't think it will come as a surprise to any of you that grazing heifers were lighter on average than dry lot heifers, both after that winter period and also going into their first breeding season. And we're actually about 115 pounds lighter on average. Those grazing heifers also had a lower average daily gain. They were gaining about 1/2 to 6/10 of a pound less on average per day compared to dry lot heifers. So knowing that the grazing heifers were lighter, adding weight at a lower rate of gain on average is one thing, but one of the most important aspects of this research was following those heifers through 2 full breeding seasons to track reproductive performance and see if there were any differences in the percent of heifers that reached puberty by the time of their first breeding season, and also differences in pregnancy rates for those first 2 breeding seasons. So among the grazing heifers, about half of them were pubertal by the time of AI, whereas almost 90% of dry lot heifers were pubertal by the time of AI. What's interesting is that pregnancy rates, both to AI and overall pregnancy rates, were similar to one another throughout that first year. So part of that being the use of progesterone and the synchronization protocol. Also interesting is that by the time their first calving season had rolled around, that difference in weight had disappeared, and the grazing heifers and dry lot heifers were of similar weights going into their first calving season. So following those heifers for another year, when they were managed together on range for that whole next year, after their next breeding season, pregnancy rates were the same both to AI and total season pregnancy rates. So from this study, what we're seeing is that while heifers develop to a lighter weight, some of those may not reach puberty quite as soon as heifers developed in a dry lot system. Those pregnancy rates did not differ across that 60-day breeding season. So now that we've talked about a target gain approach and different systems that might work to develop heifers to a more traditional or a more moderate percent of mature body weight, I think it's important to talk about some work that's been done on the pattern of gain during the development period. So if we think about the goal of managing heifers, let's say we want to add 300 total pounds from weaning to the breeding season. So 850 pounds is about 60% of 1,400 pounds, to give you some context on mature cow size, and pick an endpoint that's in the middle of the road between the two systems. And it's pretty common that we would be wanting to add that amount of weight in about 7 months' time. So for this example, we're weaning heifers in October, November, and we'd be breeding them the following May or June to calve again the following February or March. So if we do some quick math here, if we want to add that 300 pounds in 7 months' time, that heifer needs to gain on average 1.4 pounds per day, with on average being the key word there. If that's on average, we really have two options. We can manage those heifers to gain 1.4 pounds per day each day for the entire 7 months, which is the constant gain approach here in the dash line. Or we can use what's called the low-high gain approach, where the rate of gain is lower for the majority of the development period and then increases in the last 30 to 60 days of the development period. So in this scenario, we're often able to take advantage of some compensatory gain. Economically, it's also cheaper to maintain a lighter weight animal for longer and then have a higher rate of gain in the last 30 to 60 days. There's been decades of research on this topic, and I just want to summarize a few points when heifers are developed with either a constant rate of gain or that low-high rate of gain. So there are no differences in pregnancy rates or in the time frame where those heifers calve during their first calving season. So it's kind of a reflection to not only did they get pregnant, but when did they get pregnant during their first breeding season. And then if we follow those heifers for an additional breeding season, there's no difference in second-year pregnancy rates, so after having their first calf, which is a task that we know can be difficult for those heifers that are still growing and raising their first calf. So as cattle producers, this is really encouraging, right? This is good news for heifer management because it really gives us a lot of flexibility to provide an adequate amount of gain over a set time frame. It allows us to use or source feeds that are most cost-effective for you and for your environment, knowing that heifers can be gaining weight at a lower rate of gain for periods of time without affecting reproductive efficiency later in life. From a marketing flexibility standpoint, we can utilize this approach to mirror a more traditional steer backgrounding system, even if heifers will never become replacements in the operation. So one detail that we need to be sure to consider when it comes to managing heifers is body condition. Body condition is the measure of energy reserves on an animal, and in cattle, that naturally is going to fluctuate given the time of year or the stage of production that a cow is in. So in heifers, attaining puberty and starting to have estrus cycles is heavily influenced by both nutrition and age. We just finished talking about the amount and pattern that heifers can be managed to gain. but are they impacted by the amount of body condition that they have during early stages of life? And so some research out of Minnesota using Simmental Angus heifers sought out to answer some of these questions that come up when heifers are managed to different amounts of body condition. So in this study, they had yearling heifers that were of the same weight at the beginning of the study, and then they were broken in half, and each half was fed to reach a different body condition. So half were fed to manage to reach a body condition score 7, which would be recognizable by fat in the brisket and fat in the flank. Or the other half was managed to reach a body condition score of 5, where 1 to 2 ribs might be visible. There might be a slight spinal outline visible, and there would be no fat accumulation in either the brisket or the flank. So after each heifer group reached their appropriate body condition, they were then restricted until they stopped having estrus cycles. And then after that period of time, were fed a step-up diet to regain estrus cycles. So the point of this project and this progression was to determine how initial body condition as a heifer impacted when a heifer, at what point estrus cycles stop, and when they start again, knowing that a mature cow is going to go through periods of fluctuation in body condition during a normal production cycle. So what they found was that the heifers with a greater initial body condition stayed cycling for longer while they were in that restriction phase, but afterwards, during the step-up phase, those same heifers had to reach a higher degree of fatness to start cycling again, compared to the heifers that were in a more moderate body condition. So when it comes to managing heifers, feeding to a moderate body condition should be the goal, and heifers that carry too much condition can also, down the road, have problems with either lactation or calving difficulties as well. So that leads us into what feeds you might use to manage heifers for the feedlot environment or as replacements. So the same feeds can be used. It's just a matter of nutrient density and how quickly they may put on weight, which we talked about in the pattern of gain discussion. In general, heifers are going to be less feed efficient than steers in the feedlot, but pen and bunk space as well as access to quality water is equally as important. Lastly, I just wanted to spend a minute mentioning implants because they do come up in conversation when we talk about backgrounding calves or heifer development. So the general consensus is that if you know absolutely that a calf will be retained as a replacement heifer, it's best not to implant them, knowing that there are slight decreases to reproductive performance. However, it does not always work that seamlessly, and we often don't make replacement selection decisions until much later in production. And if you can take advantage of some extra weight gain by using an implant, how might that impact replacement heifers? So the research that's been done in this area has mainly focused on the timing of implanting while following a label for a specific implant. And so a quick summary of this research is that implanting heifers at birth or within the first month of life is pretty detrimental to fertility because of the uterine development that's occurring at that time. A little later in life, the results are slightly more inconsistent. So implanting from 45 days or around 2 months' time to that 6 or 7 months of age has led to decreases in pregnancy rate by 1 to 3%. After weaning, replacement heifers are nearing the attainment of puberty, and the research on implanting heifers during this time reports decreases in pregnancy rate up to 39%. So the general consensus is that if you're absolutely certain a heifer will be a replacement, avoid implanting. Additionally, there are significant decreases in fertility if heifers are implanted younger than 1 month of age, after weaning as they near puberty, and also if they're implanted more than one time. For the heifers that may or may not become replacements, if that decision hasn't been made yet, you can take advantage of some additional growth by implanting from around 2 months of age to maybe around 6 months of age without that drastic decrease in pregnancy. But again, those research results have been much more inconsistent. So with that, I'd just like to thank you for your time and attention. If there are any questions about heifer development and management, don't hesitate to reach out at all.